Hi, I'm Naomi Murphy, and this is the Locked Up Living podcast, where we talk with a wide range of people about harsh aspects of institutional life.
We also explore some of the ways to overcome them and to grow and develop. I'm David Jones. So join us every Wednesday morning, 6 o'clock UK time, for a fresh podcast.
So today we're delighted to welcome along artist, filmmaker and art therapist Tony Gammidge. Really pleased that you could join us today, Tony. Welcome.
Well, thank you. I'm really been looking forward to it. Yeah.
Hi Tony, very pleased to meet you. Thanks for coming on to talk with us today. How did you get interested in the idea of art as therapy? What in your life led you up to this point?
Yeah, that's a good question. I've been making art. I've been an artist all my life, really. Certainly all my adult life. And I think I rather naively didn't realise that all the artwork I was making pointed to, early experiences and early trauma. I rather naively thought it was political or whatever. Now I look back on it, it sort of seems blindingly obvious that actually it does relate to kind of particularly early life, which is kind of sent to boarding school from the age of 7. And so kind of, I think there was a sort of aspect of my artwork which has always been trying to make sense of that, however unconsciously. Yeah, and I think eventually I slightly caught up and realised that the work that I was doing did have a therapeutic or a sort of sense-making aspect to it. And I think, I used to teach art, but it never quite satisfied me. But I think, it's that thing of becoming a therapist to address your own wounds, as it were. It's sort of fairly classic. So, yeah.
So you found an activity really which met your needs and was also pretty nourishing for you.
Nourishing, I'm not sure I'd use the word. I mean, you might, if you look at my artwork, you wouldn't necessarily describe it as nourishing. I was able to address some very difficult and sort of, a lot of my work dealt with self-violence. So you can see why it doesn't feel nourishing, but it was. And it, again, as I say, it's just a way to process something on a totally different level to sort of conscious mind, and it's the story making aspect of art making, which I think I've always been interested in. But again, it's taken me quite some number of years to realise that. Yeah.
What do you mean by the story making? Because don't forget, you're talking to, in my case at any rate, a non-artist who doesn't fully understand the process.
Well, as I say, I wouldn't have realised at the beginning that all of my artwork was telling a story. And when I say story making, it's because it's not just telling it with words. You're actually making the objects or making the paintings or whatever, the images. And so it comes from a slightly different place than the kind of rational mind. So it's what I call embodied storytelling or story making. So I think particularly as I started to sort of grow my artwork, went from painting, I used to be a painter, into more installation and then filmmaking. It was the stories that I was interested in, and both my own story, but it was when I started making films with other people, in prisons, etc., that I realised the potential for that and my interest, my passion. Yeah.
And there's a real overlap there with therapy, as talking therapies, isn't there? Or certainly for a lot of models of therapy, there is, even if it's not an explicit intent, there is that end product of the patient being unable to to develop a coherent narrative of their lives and make meaning of their experiences and how it's affected them. And I think some models emphasise that more than others, but you can see how there's a resonance with the artistic work that, or certainly the sort of artistic work that you're doing, where there is a movement, isn't there, through it?
Yeah, and I think, in terms of my training in art therapy, I don't think stories were ever mentioned. Uh, it was all about process, but not so much story. So again, it was something I found much later, or I realised that was what my interest was, just seeing everything through the lens of narrative.
So again, I'm coming from the position of being rather naive about everything. Does completion come into this at all? Do you get satisfaction from getting to the end position, the finished object, or perhaps that never really happens?
Do you mean in my work or in other people's work, or both?
Your work.
In my work, you're right. It never really happens. I mean, I've done about 3 or 4 films about my experiences of boarding school, and I'm sort of the last one I made. I'm happy with, and I think it's finished. Which is, over a period of 10 years, I've been making these. But there's lots more I could say. But it's a kind of pond I'm fairly reluctant to go back into. But I probably will at some point, because there's lots of different aspects of it that I haven't dealt with or looked at. In terms of resolution, no, it doesn't really resolve anything particularly. Not that I'm not doing it to resolve something, um, but there's something about, again, it's that making sense of something, and you can only do that through the process. Um, and the sort of the making of the characters, and then animating them, and editing it and adding sound, and it's another way to process an experience, and it might not be exactly what happened. It doesn't really matter. I'm not worried about whether it's factually true or not. Um, but it's trying to touch on an experience, and communicate it as well. I think that's a very important aspect of it. And there's always more people you can communicate it to. Yeah.
So actually, I think that's a really good description of the process of working through something which we use across the whole spectrum of psychotherapy, proper psychotherapy, anyway. Anyway, to move on a bit, I understand that you work a lot with animation, mainly with animation. Why do you find that so powerful?
I think, well, I've touched on this in a way, in that animation encompasses lots of different art forms. So I don't know. Maybe it's worth telling uh, people what animation is. Stop frame animation. So, for instance, you might make an object, a puppet, um, and then animation's a process of photographing the puppet, moving it a little bit, then taking another photograph, moving it a little bit, taking another photograph, and then the software on the computer joins it all together, and it gives the illusion that the object's moving. So it brings the object to life. So for starters, it's a magical medium, and when you show people when you show people how to do it for the first time, people get a sense of magic. They go, "Oh my god!" And it's so simple. So it's mind-numbingly simple. The process. It sounds complicated, but it's not. But there's so many different. I mean, the great thing in terms of prisons, the great thing about it is that it's a confident. You're not filming people. You're filming things. You're animating things. They have to make them, so they have to make them with their hands. So as I said before, there's um, a process of a kind of embodiment So they're not. It's not like if they're telling their story, and many people use this medium to tell their story. Um, so it's not like an assessment or an interview or a court report or something like that. It's from the ground up, and people can. I offer the chance for people to tell their story in their own way, and tell what story they want to tell. Um, I'm not saying tell the story of your life or your offence or your early life or anything like that. I give people choice. Uh, so there's a great, and I make people director of their film. So you're the director. I'm just here to help you. Um, you're the director. You're in control, and that's quite a novelty for a lot of people, particularly in prison. Who have very little, as you both know, they have very little autonomy and control and say in their story. Um, I've found it to be very powerful, very emotive in a surprising way. You can think of animation as being something like Wallace and Gromit or something like that, which is, it's kind of more humorous. It's got humor as well. Things are always falling apart, heads are always falling off, things like that. Puppets always falling down or something like that. There is a slapstick quality. Um, but it's, and I wouldn't have known this until I did it, that it's incredibly emotive medium. And people who are not emotional make incredibly emotional films. Um, People who wouldn't know what an emotion is, generally, except rage, maybe. Um, so it's a really powerful medium, and it doesn't tend to trigger people. I've noticed people can make incredibly poignant. I've had people make films about sexual abuse, finding their mum dead from a heroin overdose, all sorts of things. All sorts of, as you can imagine, and it doesn't seem to send them off into a tailspin. People can, and I can explain more about the kind of the process of it, which helps with that. Perhaps a bit later, but it seems to, animation. And I didn't know this when I started. I didn't know much about trauma theory when I started. It's I've been doing this for like the last 10 or 12 years. And as I've sort of become more familiar with trauma theory, I found that animation just has there's a real sort of look-alike in many of the things.
Well,
I
as
can
you were
unpack
talking,
that more, but yeah, sorry.
so no, sorry, Tony, I thought you'd finished. And as you were talking, I was reminded of there's a little clip of Andrew Huberman from Huberman Lab talking about the role of eye movements in the treatment of trauma, and how if we are moving, if our eyes are moving, it signals to our brains that we are moving through, as if we're moving through space. And actually, what that does is suppresses the amygdala, and enables us to engage with something, because it's as if we're directly approaching the thing that we're threatened by or frightened of. And so he suggests that that's what's effective about EMDR, that eye movement allows us to approach in our narrative something that's traumatized, potentially traumatized, or has been traumatizing for us. And I'm wondering if there's a link there with what you're doing in animation, because there's that sense of motion and movement in the
Mm.
work, and whether that plays into that amygdala suppression in order to help people tell their stories.
I think so. Yeah, I think that I don't. I'm not a great expert on EMDR, but the process is incredibly slowed down. It takes patience to do animation, but so you're slowing an event right down, and then you can rewind it and then go back forwards again. So it's a bit like EMDR, and there's the other aspect. It's kind of like it maybe enables the amygdala to communicate with the frontal lobes a bit more. So there's two parts of the brain in operation. So there's the process and the event, and is what Janina Fisher talks about in terms of dual awareness, which is you might be animating, like with Gary, who animated finding his mum dead from a heroin overdose. Um, so he was in the process. We were in a room with other participants, and there was an awful lot of banter. You know, he used humour as a lot as a way of sort of staying stable and in the present moment. Um, and he was working really closely with me. Um, and so he was very much in the here and now, but also animating a scene from his past, which he, you know, afterwards we talked about that, and he said he's never thought about that. He's never wanted to go there, but he was very clear that he wanted to animate that scene, which interested me in the first place, really. Um, so, and what was interesting was that it was fine. He didn't seem to be traumatized by it. And then the next week we did the voiceovers for that scene, and he did the voiceover with a prison officer, female prison officer, who played his mum. And that seemed to have triggered him, and he didn't come back for a few weeks. And he said, I was very upset by that. So again, that was a mistake on my behalf. But so it's interesting. Yeah, I think it's something about, and it's a kind of bilateral um, process. You're working with the hands, the brain, the memory. You're working with all different parts of the brain.
Thank you, Tony. Are there many people practicing therapy in this way?
I don't know. I don't think so. No, I mean, there was, when I first started doing this, there was an OT in Devon who'd had a kind of big grant from the Wellcome Trust, and she was developing this work alongside me. I haven't heard from her for a long time, but um, I mean, I train quite a lot of people. I do lots of training to arts therapists, not, you know, and other professionals and educators. And there's a few priory clinics that are kind of you know, they're wanting to set up animation therapy. I wouldn't call it animation therapy, but so they're setting up animation therapy, which I'm sort of in supervising. But there's not, I say, I've probably trained lots and lots and lots of people, and and some people take that into their clinical practice. But it's complicated. It's kind of it's because, you know, particularly in prisons, you can imagine taking all the equipment in, and you know, it's takes a lot of time, and so it's a bit niche, I'll have to admit.
Yeah, I suppose I was wondering how easy it's been to manage to get to work in a prison offering this kind of therapy. It's really hard to do anything new in a prison environment. So I kind of like bulk a bit at thinking about the process of overcoming all the barriers to change that are there in a big bureaucracy.
I think when commissioners have the idea and then they hand over the process to someone below them, I think those people balk at it as well. Oh God, it's quite a thing. Um, yeah, I think, well, I started off working in forensic, you know, in secure units in mental health. So, and at the Bracton, so it was much easier. And Bracton at that time was quite relaxed about things like that. And so that's how I started. And I mean, yeah, it's kind of, I thought it'd be a one-off thing, and that would be that. And that was like 12 years ago. So I've managed just about keep going. It's got a feast or famine, but that's freelance for you. And I think, yeah, mostly it's people put off by the sort of the kind of the bureaucracy and the logistics. Um, but it's possible, and I've been in. I've lost count of the amount of prisons I've been in now in the southeast. Probably most prisons in the southeast, apart from my local one in Lewis, obviously. Uh, so it's complicated. I can't remember what the question was.
I say, I
Um,
was just wondering about managing to overcome barriers to change, and I guess, I think it's interesting that you've done that. It's mainly prisons in the same sort of cluster, so within that locality. So my guess is there's a trust between governors of different prisons, so that once it's been in one place, and often I think in prisons there's a competitiveness as well, isn't there? Something happens that works well in one prison, and then the next prison wants a bite of the cherry as well. But moving on
it's
from.
got an enduring. You've got a product at the end of it as well. I don't like to call it a product, and so they use the films for training prison officers and various people, and because often people tell their stories, and it gives an insight, and yeah, I don't think it's so much for therapeutic kind of value. I think there is that therapeutic value, um, but it's the fact that it has a kind of public sort of face, and there is a PR angle to it, I think, probably. Yeah, and yeah, I mean, yeah, Millfields, in fact, uh, commissioned me once. There was going to be a International Association of Forensic Psychotherapy conference, and they wanted service user voice because obviously people in locked facilities can't go to conferences in wherever it was in Belgium, I think. So that was one way of taking their voice, um, for instance. Yeah.
And it's quite challenging working in a prison anyway, as somebody who's not directly employed by the prison service, in terms of you can be viewed with a bit of suspicion if you don't work for the prison service. Often principles and ethos, cultural values around work can be quite different working in a prison. But I wondered, I've mainly worked within quite a large team in prisons. I wondered what it was like for you going in as a lone practitioner into a prison using a pretty novel therapy.
Yeah, it's challenging. Yeah, it's. I think yeah, it's very lonely, and it makes me very anxious on many different levels. In a way, the actual work itself is the most least anxiety provoking thing. But obviously, I want the thing to work, and there's some pressure for it. Um, to get something in the end. And I think it's always, I was going to say, I always think it's a miracle that anyone asks me to go into prison to make this. It's a miracle. And it's a miracle if anything comes of it, because there's so many barriers and things that get in the way. And it's so unpredictable and chaotic and inflexible. That it's so I kind of go in on that level that it's a miracle. If anything happens, it's a miracle. But as we know, that there's quite a lot of sort of magic and miracles that happen in these very difficult places. But it's difficult. Some places are easier than others. Put it this way, they really vary massively. I mean, I worked in a women's prison, and not so long ago, say last beginning of the year, and was very much attached to the team. It was an enhanced therapy service, and I was always working with a psychology assistant because I didn't have any keys. So, and that was a very different experience. But generally, it's me kind of lugging all my equipment around through gates, and just sort of wondering how I'm doing, going there. It's sort of I'm very much on my own, or working with a prison officer who have a different one every week, and I don't know who they are, and there's no sense of trust or safety there. So yeah, and it's some sort of strange things have happened. Once I got left, I've forgotten about basically. I was in a porter cabin somewhere, surrounded by fences, and the only way to draw attention to myself was to press the alarm button. But that's an extreme. It didn't happen very often, but it's a sort of slightly nightmarish.
I've known that happened to a custodial manager. Actually, he got locked in our porter cabin, and there wasn't a working phone. So I don't know how he actually managed to draw. I think maybe he used a radio or something, but I don't know how he drew attention to the fact he was there. But these things do happen. But that is kind of quite a nightmare scenario. But I was wondering, Tony, how do you get clients for the work that you're doing? Are you looking for a particular kind of situation or client to work with, or do you just let the prison just know that you're there and you're at the mercy of who they send to you?
Yeah, good question. Um, Ideally, what I'll go in before the project starts, I'll go to, say, a community meeting if they have them, and say, I'm going to be doing this. Um, you're welcome to come along. And I show some films if they've got like a television or something like that. I'll show some films from previous projects, and just say, you might want to tell a story, you might want to tell your story, you might want to make something up, but you can make a film about anything you want. I don't like being given a theme by commissioners because it doesn't really work. So that's the way it works. But it's usually someone puts a sign up, a kind of little notice up, and you have to sign up for it. But that's hopeless because no one knows what the hell it is that I'm offering, and it doesn't really work. And I usually have to gather people whilst I'm there and kind of have to talk people. I don't like persuading, or I don't use coercion in any way. But it's. I did some work on a secure training centre for children's secure training centre, and they sent us a whole load of people. I was working with someone else then, luckily, and none of them worked. It was like the people who go, oh, that's the person's interested. That never works. It's really, really interesting. It's always the most unlikely people, the people who you'd think would never do it. They're the ones that do it. It's always the person who's like the kind of, oh, that person's a great artist. He'll love to do it, and I can guarantee they won't do it. And it's sort of the opposite. There's someone who they're the biggest trouble on the wing. They're about to be kind of whatever sent into seclusion. They're the ones that generally do it, or it's the most unlikely people. So you know, it's a sort of it's sod's law a little bit, and luck, and that's the nature of the beast, I think, really.
Thank you. And I understand that you're quite interested in concepts that come from things like sensory motor ways of working. So the idea of incorporating the body more and vagus nerve theory. Can you say a little bit about how you make that relevant to your work?
Yeah, well, I've talked a little bit about embodied narrative, in the terms of, and we know that trauma is often kind of felt and located, somatically. So it kind of makes sense that a way of telling stories through the body, that kind of makes sense in terms of someone telling a different kind of story. I mean, I've got an example of a woman called Irene. This wasn't in a prison. Um, she was in a mental health setting, and she'd been sexually abused by her father from the age of 6 um, for 10 years, and she told her story. She was very clear that she wanted to tell that story, and she made all of the puppets out of plasticine, and she told her story with her hands. It was extraordinary. So there's one bit where she's talking about the judge, where her father was prosecuted, um, and she was cross-examined, and she told us about, this wasn't even when we were filming. Um, she was just saying, oh, the judge was such an amazing man, and while she was doing that, she was stroking his head, the puppet's head, and I filmed her doing that, and then when we evaluated the project, she was holding the puppet of her as a child. So we're kind of getting into parts work here as well. The sort of the so she's holding her puppet of herself as a child, and while she's talking about the process, she's soothing the child. The child of her. So it's an internal family system kind of, because she was a massive self-harmer. So there's things like that, bits of narrative. She also, had their parents, she would stick knives into them. so there was also an element of violence as well. But she couldn't do that literally, but she could do that, somatically, and then for her it wasn't a violent thing. It was she was giving them back the scars that they gave her, literal scars of self-harm. So she said that's where they belong. So she was giving them back. And again, it doesn't work if you say it in words particularly, but it worked, somatically. I think, and there's lots I've talked about dual awareness, in terms of the Janina Fisher sort of thinking about, so someone's in the present moment, but and very much caught up in the process, but also animating something from a traumatic scene from their past. So they remain in the present, sort of 1 foot in kind of the present, 1 foot in the past, and they're with me. It's a collaborative process. So my role is to facilitate them. So step back if they're fine and they're getting on with it, and step in if they're struggling. So it's a bit of a dance.
Thank you. And you haven't only worked with people who are detained in hospitals or prisons, you've also worked with refugees, and I wonder what the similarities and differences are in working with this population as opposed to people who've come into contact with the criminal justice system.
I suppose one of the similarities is they're both hostile. There's a sort of concept of hostile environment, which you see very, very. You see, well, a hostile environment. The term was coined in reference to refugees and asylum seekers, but as we all know, is that our prisons are also hostile environments. So there's this sort of similarity. That's the similarity, and obviously a lot of asylum seekers end up in detention centres. Some ended up in Elmley Prison, didn't they? Recently, some unaccompanied minors ended up in Elmley Prison. So it's so there's a real crossover. I think but it's very, very different. It feels so different. It's sort of. I think with asylum seekers and refugees, that there feels to be much more resilience, and not so much trauma. Although people are still in the sort of sympathetic sort of fight flight. I mean, we work in Art Refuge. We're working with people who's still travelling, so they might be in Calais or northern France, or in camps in Kent or something like that. There's a waiting kind of asylum claims. So they're very much in limbo. So they're not settled so much. But it's a very different, and I think people that I've worked with in prison, they're settled in a funny kind of a way. It's not quite the right word, is it? I'm stuck, maybe a better word. So in polyvagal terms, more in dorsal. Sort of everything's a bit hopeless, and a lot of people in the last project I worked with in Brixton were an IPP, so very much stuck and in despair. But yeah, I think I've found that people in prison are much more in a place to explore their trauma or make work about their trauma and about their experiences and wanting to do that. But less so asylum seekers. But I think because it's still ongoing. They're not in a reflective space yet. But also there's not necessarily the early attachment wounds. The trauma's more recent.
Thank you. Tony, why do you think you've gravitated towards working with such marginalised groups of people?
Oh, God, that's a good question. I don't know. I mean, I've got some ideas, and I'm really interested in why we end up doing the work that we do. Why, when I first started doing art therapy, I had no idea I would want to work in prisons, and as I said, I'm not even sure I do, but I'm sort of fascinated by it and drawn to it, and drawn to working with people in exile. I suppose they're both exiled, and I've sort of touched upon right at the beginning my own early experiences. I suppose in terms of early family loss, sort of unresolved grief, but also being separated from my own family in terms of being sent away to another hostile environment. You know, boarding schools are hostile environments. They're just very expensive hostile environments, um, and sort of so in a way, the people I'm working with, there's a kind of, there's a sort of level of understanding of the trauma, you know, and I don't have to think too hard about it. I don't. There's not a kind of imaginative leap. I'm kind of there in a funny kind of a way, and again, abuse is rife in boarding schools, and as it is in, for people in prisons, but also for people, before they've got to the prisons, and in the system, in terms of the asylum system, is full of abuse. So it's kind of, I was going to say it's not comfortable in any way, but I know the territory.
It's quite interesting to hear you refer to it as boarding school as a hostile environment as well, because certainly we've had guests on, Richard Beard, Simon Partridge, um, Raphael Viola, Joanna Britton, Piers Cross talking about boarding school, and that's certainly that sense of boarding school being a hostile environment, and also certainly I think Richard Beard talking about that being deliberately cultivated in order to, as if it was somehow going to create pupils who are resilient adults, but of course actually ending up often being quite disconnected from, because it is such a harsh environment for a child to survive.
It's brutalizing, but in some people it teaches them to be brutal. Um, I've been doing some work in Myanmar, not literally but online, and apparently the sort of children of the military send their children to military boarding schools where they're systematically brutalized, so that they learn how to become brutal themselves. So it's not that different to our system, really. Yeah.
And yet it sounds like you're offering it in a way that is therapeutic, in terms of talking with us about your process and what you're doing. And I'm wondering if some of that is about, it's hard to do something novel because it's putting yourself out there, isn't it? I suppose the thing with animation is you're not centre of the film that you're making, your objects are, but I'm wondering if there's a visibility in offering something that, it sounds like it could be really therapeutic for some people.
I think I've noted, and I think all the projects I do. I don't call it therapy. I think it's therapeutic. It's what I'd call arts therapy, but the emphasis is on the art and the making of the film rather than the therapeutic relationship and the usual transference stuff. It's all there, but I'm not focusing on it so much like you would in a sort of normal psychotherapy. It's different boundaries as well, like, because I'm taking on a collaborative role. I'm facilitating and being collaborative. So bits of me will come into the, in terms of the edit when I'm editing it, because I edit the films. So there's different boundaries, I think, and I haven't quite squared that with the, yeah, it's a bit of a grey area, as you're hearing, which I've never resolved. Sorry.
It wouldn't, sorry, Tony. I just wanted to push you a bit more. I'm just wondering why you're not. If you can mentor, you've got the skills in animation, and are trained as an art therapist, and you're mentoring other people to make use of it as art therapy. I suppose it does leave the question of why aren't you? Cut it out if you want. You don't have to answer if you don't want to, but it just seems like you've got a talent that you're not using.
Yeah, that's a good question. You are pushing me, and as I don't, I think there might be some stuff from, I kind of lack of confidence around that area in terms of I've never been that keen on doing private practice anyway, which sounds ridiculous in that I'm willing to go into a prison or into a kind of, there's something about having a buffer, a sort of an institution. So it might be something to do with that. Um, but it's an interesting question, and never say never. I'm going to be thinking about this quite a lot. I think it's no one's ever pushed me on this one before. Interestingly enough, I think I'm working through something. I had a bad experience on some with private practice stuff, and which actually involved film, and there's a bit of me I think never again. So maybe that's that. Uh, um, there's also as you're digging, um, there's also something about, I don't know whether to say this or not, but I'm going to anyway. There's also something about not calling it therapy, which seems to, if I went into a prison and said, right, we're going to be doing animation therapy, I would put off half the people who would come along. So you've got two words there. Well, art therapy is two words which are problematic: art and therapy. For a lot of people, people can go, don't like art, we're always bad at art at school, I don't want to go near therapy. Whereas if I go into prison and say, we're going to make a film and I will help you make a film and tell us any story that you want to tell. And people tend to, so it's slightly dishonest in a way, isn't it? Because I'm sort of drawing people into telling stories that if I was doing art therapy, I don't think they would tell those stories so quickly.
I'm sure that's true, but I do think there are also people, and maybe more younger people. I think there's something quite cool about animation, and actually, I think that might allow people a way to opt into trying to engage with their stories in a positive way. Where my guess is if you were offering it as a therapy, people would come for that because the novelty of that and the using a different medium would I can imagine there'd be people for whom that would have massive appeal and make it feel viable to engage with their own story in that way.
I think, yeah. Well, yeah, I hope so. I think, there's also a bit of me think, the more negative part of me thinks art therapy is niche and animation even more niche. It's just not exactly a great business model, but maybe it is. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Tony. How do you look after yourself? How do you keep yourself well and in balance?
So that's a good question. Well, it's a question I get asked a lot as well when they see some of the films that people make and some of the awful stories that get told. Um, I get asked this question. I've never come up with a very satisfactory answer, or never a very convincing answer. I think the bits that I find really difficult, bits I've already mentioned, which is the bureaucracy, it's the kind of intimidation of the institutions, which is what sends me into feeling very
Mm.
unsafe and very insecure and frightened. Um, when someone's actually engaged in a project and is telling their story, however traumatic it might be, it is nearly always a hugely joyful experience. And with Irene, who I mentioned before, it was one of the most meaningful, joyful experiences I've ever had. It was hilarious. She was such a character. We used humor a lot. Um, and there's something about someone processing something and making sense of something and working, there's a kind of alchemical process of, turning something awful into something beautiful. Um, and that doesn't result for me in vicarious trauma. As I say, the trauma for me comes in through the institutions, the anxiety of something doesn't work, or if someone does act out, and that's again, lone working is scary. It happens very rarely. Um, I think, obviously I do the usual thing. I make my own work. I make my own films. and using materials, I think I started telling my own stories, having worked with other people's stories. I wasn't doing that consciously before. That's been massively helpful for me, and grounding and calming. All the usual things, sort of walks and dogs and all that kind of stuff. Supervision. But I also think, again, boarding school thing, and this isn't the healthy part of me here, but I'm very good at sort of putting things in places where they don't hurt, a dissociation. And so I don't, I mean, I was really interested to hear you, Naomi, talk about feeling and expressing emotion in prisons, and training prison officers to express emotion. And I find that extraordinary and really hopeful. Um, I think for me, I'm quite open, but I'm not feeling emotional, particularly in terms of feeling sad, or sometimes I do. Sometimes it'll come in. Particularly in the women's prison, it was sometimes does some yeah something gets in sometimes. In the women's prison, I was there with a team, and we go, oh my god, that was awful. That was really, really awful. I worked with someone who was forever in the isolation unit, and there was so much sabotage going on in terms of her work with me, and it was continuously awful. But I had a whole team to process that with. So I think it's the usual stuff. It's if I can work with a team, but it's when I'm on my own, and that's difficult. And supervision's difficult because no one really understands what I do, and there's not many people who understand the process of it that well. So I have to choose carefully. So that sort of answer, not, as I say, not a very satisfactory answer, but it's the best I can do.
That was great, Tony. I really enjoyed the conversation with you. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much indeed. Very thoughtful.
Yeah. Well, thank you for asking me. I was really, delighted to be asked, and it's such an important podcast.